But the albatross around the state's neck is a $4.2 billion deficit. Today on Austin Faith Dialogue, a look at the religious community's response to the state's fiscal crisis and its impact on those in need.
This is Austin Faith Dialogue, a public affairs program discussing the important crossroad of religion and life, produced by the Austin Metropolitan Ministries in cooperation with KTBC-TV. Austin Faith Dialogue highlights the interaction of the religious community with the social and cultural issues throughout our area. Now, today's edition of Austin Faith Dialogue.
Hello, I'm Richard Thompson, pastor of Central Presbyterian Church, and your host for this edition of Austin Faith Dialogue. President Bill Clinton recently stated that the states should be the testing ground for new ideas in government. Well, one thing both the state of Texas and the federal government share is a large and growing budget deficit. In the Lone Star State, it's $4.2 billion over the next 2 years. So, Texas may become the testing ground for government's war on budget deficits. The question raised is how the state's religious community plans to respond to the impending crisis upon the disadvantaged in our state. Today on this program, we will turn our attention to the litany of possible horrors proposed by the Legislative Budget Board as state leaders, on the one hand, promise no new taxes, but while our state's population and levels of need grow on the other hand. Here's a list of potential recommendations to current human services. First, to reduce monthly payments under the Aid to Families with Dependent Children from $57 to $45 a month. Also proposed is the elimination of medications and other medical services for over 10,000 indigent victims of the AIDS virus. Eliminate the nursing home services of 13,000 senior citizens. Finally, the possible elimination of vaccinations for 300,000 children of low-income families. While subsequent proposals by Governor Ann Richards softened the suffering these groups would undergo, the pain for what in the biblical tradition is called the least of these would still be considered disproportionate by many. Helping us gain a better perspective on this current fiscal and social crisis will be two guests who are playing roles in dealing with these issues. We are first joined by Sue Thornton, the Director of Texas Impact, a special advocate for human services in the state of Texas. We thank you, Sue, for joining us.
Thank you, Rich.
And I'd like to just recollect with you that it was 2 years ago that we were on this program talking about this same subject, facing the same dilemma, and that 2 years before that, I happened to be interviewing the executive director of Impact at that time, talking about this same set of problems of such massive shortfalls in the budget. The question is it, was it Yogi Berra who said deja vu all over again?
That's absolutely correct. In fact, it's been rather discouraging for those of us who are advocates in health and human services, because with these proposed cuts in many areas, we're stepping back, having to fight battles that we fought 10 years ago.
Mm-hmm. So it's the fact that there's no progress being made in this regard. I mean, that looks to be the upshot of it.
Well, lawmakers are in a pinch again, being able to put together a budget that meets the needs of the state without raising taxes. And so what it appears that they are down to doing is basically floating the budget of the state of Texas on the back of the poor.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, I guess I have to say that one of the things that is just incredible that people moving to Texas learn that we are just at the bottom of the list of states providing human services. I think Mississippi is below us, but we're just 49th in the ranking. Is that still the case?
Well, actually, we're 48th. We're today above Alabama and Mississippi, but with the proposed budget reductions, it would lower Texas' ranking, and we would be only above Mississippi.
Mm-hmm. Well, to float the deficit on the backs of the poor, this list that I just read, I know is, you could expand on that. What's your feeling about Translate that from statistics to human terms for us.
Well, basically, these are cuts in the most vital programs that the state of Texas funds in order to provide for the needs of its most needy citizens. These are folks who are dirt poor. Their average annual income is somewhere below $20,000 a year for a family of 4. And again, these cuts basically bottom out these most vital of services, shifting the burden from the state in taking care of its citizens down to local jurisdictions, to local communities. Because many of these folks will literally be out on the streets with no place to turn except to local governments and to local churches for assistance.
And these folks include a variety of age groups. I mean, it's not just the children.
No.
It's not just the 300,000 children that aren't going to get vaccination shots, but it's they're elderly folks.
Correct.
And
AIDS victims, who of course cover all age ranges. So we're really dealing with a huge population group and a wide variety of people with a wide variety of needs.
Okay, now compared to where we were 2 years ago, I mean, I remember that at that time it was, the budget deficit was, I don't know if it was, is this the biggest that's ever been?
Well, it depends upon how sharp you make your pencil. Actually, the budget deficits seem to be between $5 and $6 billion for the last couple of years.
And speaking of sharp, I think is it John Sharp who's been sharpening that pencil and has said that there is some new money coming along. Tell us about that. I mean, that's what you read in the newspaper too.
Well, Comptroller Sharp, in his latest report against the grain, has identified some 400 plus possible ways that the state could find some one-shot pockets of money that could be pulled together to one more time bail us out of this budgetary shortfall. However, most of us are concerned with some of his recommendations because they really seem to get back into a lot of the smoke and mirrors games that lawmakers have played for the last 2 regular sessions, and we're really very concerned that that money is very soft. Some of it may well get us through the next 2 years if it were combined in the right ways. Other recommendations include dealing with the federal government in programs that may or may not be in place and totally intact over the course of the next 2 years. So we're very concerned that the state budget is just still very fragile.
So when you say soft, it means that if suddenly, over the next 2 years, if the federal money wasn't forthcoming or the funds weren't being produced in some other way, the legislature might have to meet in special session and go through it all over again.
For example, one of the proposed ways of trying to come up with the $2.5 billion that Health and Human Services needs is to do what's called a disproportionate share program with the federal government, where certain hospitals in the state of Texas would be taxed and those dollars would be sent to Washington for federal matching dollars. Those dollars are potentially extremely soft. Most of the political folks that I know believe that that disproportionate share program will be eliminated by the federal government at some point in the near future.
So the odds are that you wouldn't be able to count on that.
Absolutely, and if that would happen in the course of the coming biennium, for example, in 1994, when the governor and several other key state officials are up for re-election, it's not going to be very popular to come back in a special session.
Well, why don't we pause just for a moment to have you tell us just how IMPACT seeks to make an impact?
Well, we are continuing to mobilize our forces to alert folks to the
Now,
budgetary crisis.
what's our forces?
Our forces are a network of several hundred individuals across the state, congregations across the state, both Christian and Jewish.
So it's an interfaith movement that you're connected with.
Absolutely. And we are keeping our folks abreast of the changing situation through action alerts. We have also recently had a number of lobby days here in Austin where we have brought in several hundred people from across the state.
And to lobby in behalf of these human services that you're talking.
Absolutely.
It's not the school funding crisis that you're addressing.
No,
Tracy.
we're not addressing that. We are strictly dealing with at this time, the health and human services needs. So we are asking people to come to Austin during these lobby days, visit with the key experts in government, and then we have scheduled time for them to go and actually visit with and talk with their own senators and House members.
That's interesting because most churches don't, and synagogues too, I think, don't perceive themselves as being connected to lobbying efforts. And I mean, it seems to be a contradiction of the separation of church and state to be involved in politics in that way. How do you respond to that?
Well, some folks tend to get the notion of separation of church and state a little backwards. It was set up so that the government did not get involved in the church, but the church, of course, is involved in the government. For years in the state of Texas, the religious community has been in partnership with the government, particularly the Department of Human Services, in helping make sure that that folks in local communities have the best access to these services, information about these services. So it's something that we've been involved in for a long time.
And it's not something where the religious community has an axe to grind in terms of trying to get benefits for their private schools or something of that sort.
No, and that's the other reason why it's so very important that people actually make contact with their elected officials, because all the other so-called interest groups have a myriad of high-paid lobbyists and others who come
And
up here.
if Texas Impact wasn't there, the poor people have no lobbies. I mean,
Absolutely.
you're trying to give a voice to the voiceless, I guess is what.
And what happens is that legislators can sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that it's okay to balance the budget on the back of the poor because they don't hear from anybody about it.
I see. Well, I think that what you've given us here is a good overview as well as of the problem and how the religious community is seeking to make a creative response. And we're going to have to pause here just for a few moments for a break, but stay with us and we'll return to Texas Impact.
Serving Austin means serving you. Each day, Austin Metropolitan Ministries is religion in action, providing affordable housing, caring for the elderly, marching against hunger, and much more. AMM promotes understanding, cooperation, and social involvement. So when we ask for your help, we're really asking to help you, Austin. To find out how you can help Austin Metropolitan Ministries help Austin through its member organizations, just call 472-7627.
We're back on Austin Faith Dialogue, welcoming you to this discussion today about Texas impact and the needs of human services in our state. We're joined by Camille Miller, who is the Director of Staff for the Senate Health and Human Services Committee. And Camille, we thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Rich.
And I'd be interested to know about how you happened to have come to this position, and just give us a little sense of who you are.
Okay. Well, I have I've been interested in the health and human services area most of my life. I have a graduate degree in social work. But I had gotten into the employment area and met Lieutenant Governor Hobby, worked on one of his campaigns in regard to AFDC and also on employment programs. And after that, he hired me on his staff. I worked for him 8 years, then worked for Bob Bullock, both in the Comptroller's office and when he came to the Lieutenant Governor's office. I left last August to go be the interim director for the new Protective and Regulatory Services Child Protective Agency, and have just resigned that position this past month, and have taken this job with the new Senator Zaffarini, who is the new chair of the Health and Human Services Committee, and also a friend that I met whenever I was working for Governor Hobby when she was in her first term. So it's a real pleasure and a great opportunity for she and I both.
It seems to me you have kind of evolved yourself to the spot, which is really the hot spot right now in this particular session of the legislature.
You bet, Rich. This is the most challenging session I think that we've faced yet in terms of the problems with the budget, but more importantly in terms of those problems possibly being taken out on the backs of the poor.
So what Sue Thornton was saying earlier about I think it was, wasn't it, Ben Sargent, the cartoonist for the Austin American Statesman, had titled Women and Children First, only instead of the women and children being escorted to the lifeboats, they were being escorted off the plank to take the fall for others.
Ben Sargent is just always great. He has a way of capturing in a cartoon the essence of what we're talking about, and that's really true. This time, with the problems with public education, the enrollment increases in higher education, and then the results of, I believe, years of neglect in the health and human services area, we are quickly approaching having in the neighborhood of 93,000 to 95,000 inmates in our prisons in Texas. And many of us in the health and human services field feel like that if we did that prevention on the front end and intervention on the front end, that we wouldn't be spending the more than $16,000 a year that's spent to house a prisoner in our prison system. It costs far less than that to do our job right on the front end.
It's the ounce of prevention worth a pound of cure.
Absolutely,
kind of thing.
absolutely.
Well, you know, this is one of the things that's puzzled me about the current debate over the deficit and how to cut back on human services in order to offset it. And I think it was the People First Coalition that came out with the publication, I know you're familiar with that,
You bet.
that said that so we make these cuts, like in the area of AFDC or helping people who have AIDS with their medication and so on, that if you do that, then you lose much more in federal matching funds. I mean, it doesn't seem to make even good economic sense.
Well, Rich, if the current cuts stay in place, we will lose $2 billion worth of federal match funds that would be available to the state of Texas now. And when you just talk about a person's fair share of the federal pot, Texans get on the average about $3,000 per Texan share of that federal pot. New Mexico, right next door to us, gets double that. They get $6,000. New York, California, Florida, other of the Big Ten states that Texas is one of the Big Ten, all get far, far more. But the more important thing, even than the proportional share being unfair, is the fact that Texas has then remained at the bottom of the rung in terms of doing things for our people in need. And that's just devastating. If you look long-term at the economic impact, we talk about Texas's economic future and looking at development. Healthcare is part of that infrastructure.
Okay, well, if it doesn't make economic sense, but we might do it anyway, Why are we, it seems like, have a compulsion for a kind of self-destruction in this regard? It seems to all come back to the fact that we don't want to raise our taxes. The middle class is feeling the pinch, not only by state taxes, but they feel like federal taxes. And,
Right.
and somehow the whole discussion about an income tax as a way of relieving the local property people and spreading it out further is, in the religious circles, we would call that a heresy to even talk about it. Why is that such a sensitive, almost taboo subject?
Well, people don't like taxes. And one of the things that I have seen occur in my 10 years or so with the Texas Senate is much more polarization in terms of political parties. And I think this election, this last time, where the Republicans made pretty significant gains, and a lot of discussion was around the issue of no taxes. And some people feel like Bush got defeated because he said, read my lips, no taxes, and then he did taxes. So I think there's a real, genuine fear on the part of elected officials that the public just is not going to stand for any more taxes.
Okay, well, if that is a given, and there's just so much to go around, and you've got a growing population, and the needs are increasing. I mean, even if the needs weren't increasing, you got a growing population.
Absolutely.
But with this social net fracturing and pulling apart in so many ways, the needs are increasing. Then we're left with the prospect of a kind of massive suffering, it seems to me, that would make Texas sort of like a third world country.
Well, you're absolutely right, Rich. I think that that there is hope, and none of us can ever give up. We have always got to have hope, but along with that hope, a determination. And I wanted to say, Sue Thornton and her impact organization certainly represents a bit of that ray of hope. That organization, over the last 10 years, has been the social conscience, I think, of both the public and the elected officials, because, as Sue pointed out earlier, and you were talking about earlier, most of these people, the women and children and poor, don't have the means. They don't hire the lobby people. They have no one to speak for them.
So you've seen, just from the standpoint of being inside the governmental process, that Texas Impact has made a difference.
Absolutely. My boss yesterday, Senator Zaffarini, was saying that the squeaky wheel gets the grease. The elected officials are there, and they're trying to figure out how to deal with distributing the funds that they have. They are listening to the people that are bringing them information, and Impact has been a very significant factor in that. In every one of these budget crises, they have played a role in making sure that people were considered, as well as some of the other items.
And I think the fact that it's not just one religious group, it's not just Protestants, but Catholics have joined in, and not
Jewish.
just Christians, but Jewish, and
You
it's,
bet.
that gives it a distinctiveness. And I know there's a national impact that this state impact has some connection with, so that even on the national level, there's a way of what would be called a disinterested religious witness.
You bet.
People aren't out for themselves in this case, but in behalf of others who wouldn't have lobbies otherwise.
That you've hit upon a real key point about Impact. There are other coalitions. There are several other human services coalitions
in the state of Texas.
In the state of Texas, but the main thing that Impact has different from those others is that it does not have any organizations in it that stand to gain personally by getting a contract for services or making money off of any of these programs. And that's why it is really more of a social conscience than it is, than any of the other organizations are. And the legislators listen to that. They're more open. They're not suspicious that you're going to get a buck off of this if we fund it.
All right. Well, you know, in the time that we have left, I think it's probably helpful to go back to what I was talking to Sue about in regard to some of the victims of this, if it happens. And tell me about any instances that you know where people have children, especially children are the obvious victims. How are the children of this state going to be the ones to take the brunt Any examples that you can give?
Okay, well, of course, every age category is affected by this, and we could talk in depth about each of them, but just to name a few in the children's area, when you reduce the AFDC level, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children level, you are talking about over 12,000 children a year that will not get medical services. I mean, these are very basic services. Lieutenant Governor Hobby used to talk about sending a child to school, but they can't learn because they don't have glasses, they can't read, or they can't hear. We're talking about some pretty basic services. The early periodic screening and testing and diagnostic program, if we don't catch some of those situations early, the child falls so far behind in school, becomes a social outcast. And then Child Protective Services is probably the most dramatic example. We have over 119,000 cases of reported child abuse in Texas this year. And it is projected to go to 135,000 by 1995. This is epidemic, and it's not just with children, it's adults, it's the stresses of our economy. And with the money that that agency receives right now, after they've investigated and found that the children need services, only 50% of them are funded now.
I'm sorry to have to cut us off at this point, but I think that gives us a sense of it, and I hope that as you folks watch this, you have a sense of the urgency of what affects us all. And I want to thank Camille Miller for joining us, also Sue Thornton earlier in the show, and for you folks for being with us. Join us again next week on Austin Faith Dialogue. I'm Richard Thompson. Peace be with you.